On March 5, 2020, the Faculty of Medical Sciences Teaching and Research Complex, the UWI Mona campus, held a conference entitled COVID-19 Pandemic Preparedness. Speaking on economic aspects is Dr. Christine Clarke.
So there are quite a few models actually in economics that can help us to understand why some of the information that has been presented so far has happened, and the role that economics can play in helping people to understand why, for example, even though we may know certain things, we don't practice it. So I'm just going to give you a bit of ideas as to some of the tools that we have. We talk a lot about market failures, particularly in our macroeconomic stories, and that is part of the reason why you'd have so many people trying to understand what's happening so that we can advance this global health agenda. We also have the adverse reactions, so people know, and so they think that, oh, that's why we have UE, so they can fix the problem when we get sick, right? We don't need to worry about washing our hands or doing anything like that. So economics can help you to understand why that is the case. Of course, this issue is a global public good, not just local, and our public goods models helps us to understand why we need these interlinkages, these partnerships in order to understand. And I actually try to do a bit of what we usually call in economics some back of the envelope calculations as to what some of the numbers could look like, and you'll see how close or how far away I was from some of the numbers that were presented by Dr. Webster. And then we also can help to inform the decision. We certainly would not want to make the final decision on optimal treatment versus optimal preventions. So in economics we talk a lot about, of course, the fact that we think in some cases it's best to let a market decide what the price and the quantity of a particular good or service is. But we can clearly see that in the context of health and medical infrastructure, that's not necessarily such a good idea, because people tend, for example, to do very little of the things that will help other people to be better off. So this hand washing and the different preventative mechanisms, even in the event that there's a sanitizer in front of them, they tend to do very little of that. There's just not enough done, and so in order to get them to do it, there have to be interventions into the market, these campaigns, and in some cases it could be incentives of different type depending on what the particular problem is. So on the negative side, we'd want to encourage them to do more, to do less of the negative ones, and of course more on the positive side. When we think about the public goods, though, you know, this idea that, but if everybody else is washing their hand, then I don't really need to, because I'll be covered by everybody else doing it. The problem, of course, is that if everybody else is thinking the same thing as I am, then nobody's actually washing their hands enough. And so you end up with this spiral going on there. And I'm not intending for you to read this, but generally speaking, this issue of public goods and the public health context that we're in now is one of those cases where what we refer to as public goods are things that we can't really exclude people from. Like, we can't exclude ourselves, or we can't just decide we're not going to catch COVID. We have to do things in order to do that, right? And once it starts spreading, it's very difficult to exclude anybody or get persons to participate. And so the communicable diseases has long been classified as one of those public goods that are requiring governments, institutions, agencies, even different disciplines to think about how is it we're going to actually address these problems. So in terms of the economic impacts, which I'll skip to because I think they're probably more relevant in terms of following on from the public goods argument. So I went through and found some articles specifically in relation to, I guess these are respiratory diseases or illnesses. And I just took the Jamaican population. I did a calculation based on some data. I got the fertility rate. I'm glad I picked up the right number, the 3.4% that's estimated for COVID-19. And I used in the more aggressive column, that's the second one there on the table, I used a 70% that was, I think, from the Ministry of Health's estimate of what happened under CHIKV, just to give, you know, put some numbers to what I'm talking about. And so I calculated that, well, if we use the 70% on the population, I end up with about 1.9 million people potentially in Jamaica potentially being infected. And then so if I apply the 3.4% fatality rate, we end up with maybe 60,000 or thereabout fatalities. I mean, if we were to say let the market decide, right, and we do nothing, because the market is always right. And so what I then did was say, well, and I don't know how I guessed the 30%, but I think I was somewhere in there. If 30% of those who had died had been admitted to ICU, about what would be the real cost. So we know that our public health system, it wouldn't cost anywhere near 3,000 US per day in ICU. I'm not sure. So I just did for 30% of the people who this model would say would become a fatality, what would be the cost? And you see there's a US $880 million it would actually cost to just treat 30% of those people. And I did an estimation using the same article about CHICV. If each of the persons infected were to be out of work for 10 days and they earned about 2,000 Jamaican dollars per day, what would the kind of dollar value be on that were they to have actually been part of actively in the labor force working? And that worked out to 39.2, and you know that number is very, very big, right? Billion. And then so I just did another calculation just to see what if it's less, you know, because it may be different. We know CHICV is vector borne, and you know it's just a different thing altogether. So then I used a 50% rate with the same other assumptions, and you see the numbers there. So with the information from Dr. Webster, and this is, you know, one of the things I wanted to stress, our ability to help and to give insights is a function of the extent to which we understand each of these levels that was described by the presenters that preceded me. In terms of, so those are just kind of global impacts. Pretty much you could almost say they're direct. When we look at sectoral now, so, you know, many of us are attached to a particular sector, and I definitely have the health sector up there. Of course, we have the tourism impact. We can't ignore it. A major player in the country in general. We know or expect that there could be some fallout from just the cruise shipping industry and just the challenges it's going to have from a perception issue. All of these things, you're on board, you're closed in, and if no one wants to let you off, you're kind of stuck. So the cruise ship industry, of course, for us, that represents about 184 million US dollars of potential spend on island were they to actually be able to come off normally. This is from the Tourism Board's 2018 numbers. So in terms of foreign exchange inflows, we can see what could have been some of the averted impacts. And so clearly the sector is going to need a strategy to, you know, continue to operate or maybe leapfrog to some other operational modality that would avert this in a future go-round. Of course, manufacturers are already blowing the whistle on everybody. Can't get raw materials, or will run out at a certain point and just don't know. You can't get into contact with your suppliers because they can't go anywhere. And so orders, etc., and backlogs are going to be an issue. And the containers that we used to see coming across the channels can't move anymore, so we're going to have those bottlenecks in the supply chain. And so domestically, the issue is going to be plant utilization issues. Just what are you going to do with the plants now if you don't have raw materials going through, and the depreciation issues associated with that. The wholesalers, the retailers, and the other trades that rely on imported finished products, of course, the access to finished goods and the turnaround times from orders, which some persons may say, and if you think about how some of the SDGs are couched, may cause us to question our own consumption patterns and rethink some of those linkages. For the health sector, Statin reports that there are about 33,000 persons last January employed in the health sector. I guess it's across the board. In October, it was 39,000. So, you know, Ministry of Health, I'm sure, is going to be concerned about keeping resources at optimal whilst minimizing any potential downtime. And as was mentioned before, this is coming off the back of, just increased cases and sites on dengue and other viral issues on top of the NCDs that we know are rising in the region. So the medium to longer term impacts will probably still be there, particularly in the health sector, as the sector is able to either be more resilient through this or learn from the process. In terms of a roadmap, and from our perspective in our department, and certainly in the Faculty of Social Sciences, we certainly are very interested in trying to understand all of these diseases and how they will play out in various scenarios. We would love to be able to have an integrated analysis. Okay, I kind of threw out a lot of models at you, but in the end, what is going to outweigh what? Can we have, compensating effects? Are they all going to just be aggregating on top of each other? The only way we can be able to answer those questions is through integrated models, which you can imagine are very data hungry. So all the data, all the information that we can collect, that we can, synthesize across different levels of the health sector, everything is quite important, and that is one of the plugs that I want to push for, is the availability of really detailed data sets that will enable us to identify what are these linkages and then be able to help you to forecast, to develop, for example, prediction and early warning systems. What would that look like? How would that have to look? And what would we put into that and use that in helping with the development of responses? The sectors, of course, and each country is going to have to come up and sit at the table, much like what Dr. Bruce would have presented for the hospital and UE is doing generally, would have to do it for their sector in their own nuances, knowing their supply logistics, for example. What does this mean, and alternate sources, etc. It's not going to be possible to have a one-size-fits-all approach, because each country and each sector would have its own basic profile, and what are going to be the protocols going forward. If I'm understanding what my previous presenters have said, this is not going to be a one-off event that once we get over COVID-19 will be good and we won't have to think about these crises. This is something that we have to program into pretty much our own DNA to be able to respond to or prevent as much as possible. And I think collaboration, of course, across the disciplines, leveraging these data sets, leveraging the knowledge that we're learning, most of it seems to be kind of daily, you're seeing papers being presented. How is it that we can translate that into our own models of what could happen based on what we know about our population and previous disease spreads? And so that's on the research side, which, maybe sound like an ivory tower. Of course, the crisis prevention and management, the analysis can also work there in terms of looking at these various transmission mechanisms and alternate methodologies of doing the things we do in order to reduce the pathways or close some of the pathways. And of course, accurate and timely monitoring. That's the only way to kind of know what's happening and be able to put resources behind it. So I'll stop there and hope to get some questions from you at the end. Thanks.